はい、それでは今日
Well, welcome to the special webinar, The History of the American Grand Strategy in the Asia Pacific. I am Keio University Faculty of Law Professor Hosoya. And today we have our wonderful guest, Dr. Michael Green. I have his book here, which I believe that many of you have already read. The book's name is By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia-Pacific since 1783. He has won great awards, and the Japanese translation has been recently published from Keio Shobo. There are two books from the start to the 21st century of the United States. So we have invited Dr. Green, and we would like to ask him many questions. The U.S. presidential election is over, and the next president will be Donald Trump of the Republican Party. Perhaps many of you may be aware, but Dr. Green was a staff of the NSC during the President Bush. He was a director for Asian affairs, and he was at the central position when it comes to Asian strategy, playing an extremely important role. So I would like to ask Dr. Green to talk about the history of the American grand strategy, but also about today's grand strategy. And I believe that this will be a very insightful seminar. So we will first have a 20-minute talk from Dr. Green, who authored this book. And then as commentators, we will have Professor Satoru Mori of Keio University, who was responsible for overseeing the translation together with myself. And we also have Dr. Kazushi Tani of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And we have Ms. Yuka Koshino of Keio University, and also guest researcher at WWS at London. So these will be the three commentators. So this will be today's agenda. First, presentation by Dr. Green, and then three commentators who were also a part of the translation. And then there will be a discussion between Dr. Green and the commentators, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone. He'll be speaking in English, connecting history to modern U.S., and ask him to talk about the grand strategy.
Thank you. I'll speak in English and look forward to the discussion and the comments. I am so deeply honored and grateful that Hosoya Sensei, together with Mori Sensei and Tani Sensei and Koshino-san, my former student, did such an excellent translation of this very long book. So it was a lot of work, and it was done with incredible precision. It was very interesting for me to get emails from the translators asking which words in Japanese to use for certain historical events or strategic concepts. So it was an honor, but also it was an education. And I hope people in Japan find the book helpful. I did a new maigaki, or chapter, covering Trump and Biden. It turns out my Trump chapter can be used again, so I may not have to update it. What I thought I would do is talk about four themes in the book that give us some context to understand the new Trump administration, Trump 2.0. Mark Twain, the humorist, said that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And there are certain themes that come throughout my book that that will give us a better understanding of what Trump administration 2.0 can actually do, will actually do in Asia. And frankly, at a time of real political disruption in the United States, resulting from a very democratic election, a very free, fair, open election where the American people said they want change, but we don't know exactly what kind of change. In that environment where perhaps business leaders, officials, scholars in Japan and Asia are feeling uncertain, history gives a little bit of a cushion or reassurance, but doesn't predict the future, but it does give the context. So let me mention actually 5 themes in the book that I am thinking about as President-elect Donald Trump rolls out his new cabinet and some of his policies. Social scientists and historians know that to understand international relations or politics, you have to study both structure and agency. You have to study institutions, geopolitics, balance of power, interest groups, and people, agency. Donald Trump commands a huge amount of attention, and it's very important not to lose fact or sight of structure, of institutions, of alliances, of geopolitics, of interest group politics. And history helps you remember that. It helps you remember how structure shapes things, not just agency. And also how contingency shapes things. Because in my book, Strategy Towards Asia, my book starts in 1783, when Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Colonel Clark on the frontier during the American Revolution, warning that Britain was trying to get to the west coast of Canada first, and that the United States had a interest in ensuring access to the Pacific Northwest. And so there was strategic thinking about Asia from the beginning. But often ideas were tested in reality, tested by contingency, tested by geopolitics. So these themes of structure and also contingency, we have to keep in mind, and not just focus on agency, on what Donald Trump says he'll do. So let me just touch on briefly 5 themes in the book that give us some context. The first is contingency, is geopolitics, structure. And in particular, I'm thinking back on the chapter which covered the pre-war years, the 1930s and 1940-41. In those years, the U.S. Congress and the American public were generally quite isolationist, quite reluctant to get involved in another world war after the trauma of the First World War. Quite concerned about their own economy and lives at home because of the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to push to get more engagement, but in some ways was politically cautious about things like Lend-Lease or support for Britain in particular. But geopolitics changed that, and in particular, the Axis Pact. When Germany, Japan, and Italy formed the Axis Pact, that had a fundamental impact on Roosevelt's thinking, and in the Congress and among many in the business community or the strategic community who realized that this was not just isolated challenges to Europe or Asia, but in fact a challenge to the entire international order. And that accelerated Roosevelt's political risk-taking and readiness to do more for Churchill and to deploy the U.S. Navy to Hawaii and take a higher profile and higher risk stance. And history rhymes, it doesn't repeat, but I think this is important history to remember. When Donald Trump becomes president on January 20th, it's going to be a different world from when he was president before. And one of the most significant changes is the alignment of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. My friend, the historian Hal Brands, and others have argued and they're right, that the cooperation between Beijing and Moscow and Tehran and Pyongyang is actually greater than the wartime cooperation between Berlin and Tokyo. Technology transfer, intelligence sharing. The Russians are providing targeting information to the Houthis, proxies of Iran, to target Western shipping. China is providing significant economic and technological aid to Russia. Russia is providing North Korea with technology. We don't know exactly what kind, but certainly related to submarine and missile capabilities. North Korea has 10,000 troops fighting in Ukraine. This is a level of alignment among the axis of authoritarian states that is unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. And as Hal Brands points out, actually more significant than the collaboration between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And that's going to be a factor that absolutely shapes how the Trump administration approaches Japan and approaches the world, approaches NATO, approaches Ukraine, because these are not isolated incidents or isolated security crises. They are linked globally. And even if Donald Trump can't see it, I think his cabinet and the Congress will. Second related historical theme in the book is the nature of American isolationism. And Donald Trump was interviewed by David Sanger of the New York Times in 2016, and he had no foreign policy idea, really. So he described his belief in high tariffs and forcing Europe and Japan and Korea to pay more for U.S. forces and all of that. But there was no sort of coherent framework. So David Sanger said, this sounds like America first. And Donald Trump had not heard of the history of the America First movement, but he liked the sound of it, and he said yes. And the main think tank advising Trump today is called the America First Policy Institute. Historians like Mori Sensei and Hosoya Sensei know very, very well about the America First movement. It was the isolationist movement championed by people like Lindbergh in the late 1930s and right up to World War II, right up to Pearl Harbor. And it's worth looking at that again. First of all, American society was very polarized and very angry between the isolationists on the one hand and the internationalists on the other, a bit like today. But also the America Firsters had a particular history and a particular worldview that went beyond Europe. And I think it's useful to look back at the history of the Republican Party to understand that. The Republican Party, which was formed, of course, before the American Civil War, has in one wing of the party a long history of being skeptical about Europe. In some ways, this goes back to George Washington's farewell address, when he was president and Britain and France were both trying to entrap America, the new country, in their war. But it became really quite acute in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Because in the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, where small r Republicans, democracy champions, struggled to overthrow the monarchies of Europe, and lost. Many of them were exiled to the United States, and after 1848. And in the American Civil War, there were Union, Northern regiments, divisions, brigades that were made up entirely of Irish, Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, and their generals were generals like Thomas Francis Meagher, the commander of the Irish Brigade in the Union Army, or General Schurz, commander of one of the corps of tens of thousands of German immigrants. These were leaders in the revolutions of 1848. They had lost. They fled to the United States. After the Civil War, their worldview was that America was too good. America was too pure. American democracy and the American Republican form of government, small r Republican and big R Republican Party, were too good for Europe. And they eschewed, they avoided any entanglement in European affairs. And there's multiple explanations, as always in history, but I think that DNA helps to explain the America First movement. And then after the war, the opposition to NATO in places like Ohio or Western Pennsylvania or Michigan or Minnesota. These are the same states that went for Trump. And part of it was these revolutionaries from Europe. Part of it was German Americans, Irish Americans not liking Britain. Part of it was an anti-East Coast, anti-elite sentiment, very much what we see today. But here's the interesting thing about the America First movement. Many leaders in this America First or isolationist movement were also Asia Firsters. They believed that Europe was corrupt, old, much like the Trump supporters do today, but Asia was the future. Asia was a place where American trade and ideas and influence could grow without the corrupt influence of the Europeans. So to give you examples, in 1940, after France fell to the Germans, Gallup polled the American public. I read 3 volumes of Gallup polls when I wrote this book. I was at the University of Hawaii. I should have been surfing, but I sat in a windowless room reading Gallup polls, and they're fascinating, So the famous Gallup poll in 1940, in around June or July, after France fell, show that 2/3 of the American public did not want to get involved in the war in Europe to save Britain. 2/3. But later in the poll, the public was asked, should the U.S. confront Japan in the Pacific, even if it risks war? And a majority, almost 2/3 of Americans said yes. In the opposition to NATO, many of the senators from Ohio or the Midwest argued that we should instead be confronting communist China and supporting Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan and Lee Sigmon in Korea and General MacArthur, who wanted to use nuclear weapons against China. So J.D. Vance, the vice president, who is from Ohio, went to the Munich Security Conference about 6 months ago or so, and he gave a speech that shocked the Europeans because he said Europe needs to defend itself. America cannot stay entangled in Ukraine because, he said, America needs to pivot to Asia to deal with communist China. So this is worth keeping in mind. For Japan, this is good news and bad news. The good news is that Japan is now incredibly important to these same people. None of them are anti-Japan or anti-US-Japan alliance. The bad news for Japan is Europe and NATO matter. So I think Gaimusho and the new Ishiba government are going to have to continually remind Washington that this is a global challenge and that NATO matters to Japan, Europe matters to Japan and the G7. Japan is uniquely positioned to carry that message. A third lesson, in my book I talked about how the US and American strategic leaders often were divided about the future of America in Asia, beginning in the 1850s. Is America's future with China, the biggest and center of Asian civilization? A lot of Americans believe that China's weakness meant that to prevent European imperialism from spreading, or Japanese imperialism from spreading, supporting China was the easiest way. If China's whole, then Asia will be stable. That was one view. It drew from the same logic of Sir Halford Mackinder, that whoever has the continent is dominant in global affairs. The other view was the view of the US Navy, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and more recently people like Rich Armitage, Kurt Campbell, Navy guys, that whoever controls the sea lanes and the maritime domain can control the security. That debate went on and on, actually, behind the scenes. Right through the Obama administration, when Xi Jinping proposed a new model of great power relations, the Obama administration split. John Kerry, a French-speaking Secretary of State, supported it. Hillary Clinton more skeptical of China, listening to people like Kurt Campbell, opposed it. By 2015 or 16, it was dead. And today, in polls, the American public, I did a poll at CSIS a few years ago, 80% say our most important partner is not China, it's Japan. 12 years ago, American public opinion was split, whether it's Japan or China. This is also good news for Japan because strategically there is no debate about Japan passing. Nobody is proposing that in Congress and the administration. The Trump appointees are a mix. Some are really very good. Some are puzzling. All of them are hawkish on China and see Japan as our most important partner. A brief word on trade. The book talks about this debate in America about trade. On the one hand, Americans from the beginning wanted to open markets in Asia to trade. But of course, the Republican Party was, until the 1930s, was a party of high tariffs to protect industry. The Republican Party has returned to its roots. The Republican Party has again become the party of high tariffs. I personally, we can talk about this, don't think Trump will do as much as he says on tariffs. But it's Donald Trump, so we'll have to see. But the more important point is, I think in American politics, this debate that was won from the 1930s and especially the late 1930s and especially Bretton Woods through until TPP, this debate was won by those who believed that it was in America's strategic interest to have open and free trade as much as possible. That debate is over. TPP is not going to happen. There's a new debate that Japanese officials should think about and that Japan has been a leader in, and that's the debate about rulemaking, which is not the same as lowering tariffs. It's about standards and it's about technology. Japan's well positioned to lead in that debate. And the last thing I'd say is about people. People do matter, and not just Donald Trump. You know, as Hosoya Sensei and his colleagues saw, I spent a lot of time in the book writing small biographies of ambassadors or assistant secretaries. Maybe this was my own ego, because I was senior director for Asia, so I was arguing people at that level have huge influence on history. Taking myself out of it, it's true. You think about my friend Kurt Campbell in this administration, hugely influential in strategic thinking. Armitage in the Bush administration. You know, these assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, ambassadors like Mike Mansfield in Japan had a huge influence in shaping strategic thinking. Donald Trump is an entertainer. He's not Hosoya Sensei. He's not a historian. He's not a strategic thinker. He's an entertainer. It's the best way to think of him. He doesn't think about the details or study the history of the strategy. The people who go to work for him will matter, and it's mixed so far. But Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, to me, that's very encouraging. I know Senator Rubio. He has been very much in that sort of Mahanian maritime allies tradition, very deliberately. So I don't know who will be in all these positions. It's worth watching. Some of the people Donald Trump has announced will not get confirmed or will not last. Some of them could be quite influential. Those who have thought about competition with China, strategy in Asia, are primed to engage with Japan on the best approach. It's worth remembering that Donald Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy was made in Japan. I'll just end with this quick story. So early in the Trump administration, a good friend of mine, a classmate of mine from Johns Hopkins SAIS in Gaimusho, came to Washington, and he met with Donald Trump's head of policy planning and introduced him to Abe Shinzo Sori's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And the Trump administration had no strategy. So the State Department officials who came in looked at that and said, can we use this? And a month later, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at CSIS announced that the Trump administration would have a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Pentagon had a free and open. So that continued through Biden. So the intellectual contribution of Japan is significant, not appreciated generally, but quite significant. And Japan is well positioned, maybe better than any country right now. to shape the thinking of the new administration. So a good place to start is history. So I'll end there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments. Hey.
Thank you so much. It was truly a grand history being explained, and at the same time, for the new president to come in the United States, which is an issue faced by Japan right now. How should we approach him or his administration? There was many good suggestions. Now, Dr. Green's book. Dr. Michael Green in Japan is well known that he has been for many, many years being the vice president at the CSIS. He is now the senior advisor at the moment. But at the heart of the American think tanks, Dr. Green has led the policy making for Asia and Pacific. He has for many, many years being in a very important position to lead the debate as well as policy making. But in the think tank community and on the ground and also in the policy making community, he is a well-known figure. And that is how the Japanese know about Dr. Michael Green. But Dr. Michael Green, I believe, is a superb historian as well. The AJP teller, Paul Kennedy, as in the United Kingdom, looking at many centuries, a centuries-long history, which is quite unusual and rare and truly distinguished, and had to discuss very long period of time of history, but we do not see them in the United Kingdom that many, but like Kissinger, he knows the actual practice, the government, the processes being in the practicing her position. So for 240 years long history will be able to be studied and learned through his book. And at the same time, ever since the 1980s, from the Reagan years onwards, the people who appear have been colleagues and close friends of Dr. Green, and also bosses that he has served under. So his description is truly vivid, and he has gone into a lot of precise details as well. So for the history from the 1980s, this is a primary source of history. So for those who are studying the foreign policy the history as well as international relations history, you are able to see the history witnessed by someone who has been there and present at the historic moments. And he has been right in the center of policy making and be able to explain the contribution, the role and personalities of all the people involved in those policy making. I don't see any other historian who could do the same thing. So this is highly valuable. And Professor Mori, who has been always been very busy, I have grabbed him to work with me to supervise the translation, and we have asked many other distinguished professors to also join the team so that we will be able to translate a book to the Japanese audience who will be able to read many, many times and for long years as well. Thank you. Now, from now onwards, what we would like to do is for those people the translators who have been responsible and had to ask questions and mention their comments on the chapters that they have been responsible for. To start with, for the pre-war years from the founding of the United States up until the Second World War, I would like to ask Dr. Kazushi Tani to be the commentator. He is joining us from his home. So if you could speak for 10 minutes or so, please. Dr. Tani, would you like to start?
Thank you very much for the introduction. I am Tani from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. I apologize that I was not feeling well, and I did not want to bring my illness to you, so I am at home, and I apologize if my voice is difficult to listen to, but please bear with me. So, as introduced by Professor Hosoya, I was responsible for part 1 of the volume 1. So from the War of Independence until early 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt. And Professor Nakatani was responsible for part 2, is not with us today. So that's starting from President Taft to 1945. So I would like to speak on part 1 and part 2. Allow me to speak on behalf of Professor Nakatani as well. So Professor Hosoya just commented, it's very rare, even for historians, to be able to cover such a long time frame. And with regards to part 1 that I was responsible for in the translation, I felt that way very keenly. So when it comes to U.S. politics or U.S. foreign policy, at least from the perspective of Japan, Commodore Perry is the most important development. And it is seen as Theodore Roosevelt when U.S. started to play a significant role on the international stage. And so mid-19th century to 20th century, that was the main focus when it came to U.S. diplomacy. However, in part 1 of this book, it goes back to the beginning of the U.S., even before the West Coast was not a part of the United States, that the U.S. government considered its Pacific strategy and that it had a keen interest in expanding in the Pacific. And I think that is a very significant learning for us. And this may be rather detailed, but something that left a strong impression was that I myself research British diplomacy in the 20th century. So Russia going south and the British fighting against that, the so-called Great Game, is something I'm very interested in. And there was an interesting note on that. So 19th century, early 19th century Russia, I believe, Russia had Alaska. And so going south from Alaska, and Russia had expanded to about San Francisco of today. And Russia was building its foundation in Hawaii as well. So I read this, and I was struck that Russia was also taking the same policy of developing toward the south in the American continent as well. So this was a new learning for me, and I was very interested. And this overlaps with some of the earlier comments. So even before Commodore Perry was traveling to Japan, actually America was already very, very active in terms of its marine strategy. In Indonesia, I believe it was in Indonesia, there was some collision with local tribes, or Thailand, back then it was called Sham. 20 years before Japan and U.S. signed the peace treaty, there was already a treaty between Sham and the U.S. in 1930s. So even if you just look at Asia, in Southeast Asia and in China, there was a contact between the U.S. and various Asian countries. And this is a perspective that is lost by Japanese scholars that just focus on Japan-U.S. relationships. And so including part 2, I would like to ask 3 questions. For part 1, the period that I am most interested in is under Theodore Roosevelt administration. The U.S. in this age, it was called the transatlantic turn. And so going across the Atlantic to build relationship with European countries, or expanding the presence in Europe and North Africa was seen at this time. With regards to the UK, the so-called special relationship was budding, building a very strong relationship. So under the Theodore Roosevelt administration, the European strategy, does it linked to the Far East strategy that is being described on this book? And if this did have a bearing, what was the impact? So was there consistency in Theodore Roosevelt's strategy to Europe and to Asia? I would like to ask this question first. And on part 2, Dr. Green talks about the period between the 2 wars that predicted some of the developments post-1945. So, for example, strengthening the financial relationship with Japan. This was happening in the interwar period, which actually links to the Bretton Woods system. So, U.S. strong financial power or building international order. Or another aspect is the self-determination of peoples, which was a vision that was put forth between the 2 world wars, but that came to be realized post-World War II. However, the U.S. was not able to combine these elements and was not able to carry out an effective policy in this regard. This is being pointed out in Dr. Green's book. And from President Taft to President Hoover, the individual characteristic or capability, was that the reason why the U.S. was not able to tie these elements together? Or was there more of a structural issue of the U.S. government, something that hindered effective strategy implementation, combining these elements? And the third point is Dr. Green just talked about the isolationist tendency that was prevalent pre-World War II. And when I look at World War I to World War II, focusing mostly on Asia, in terms of the collaborating with other major powers, I believe the U.S. was quite hesitant to take that approach. And I'm wondering why. In case of East Asia, I think the major powers would be British and France. And of course, there was the Washington Treaty after World War I, but there was a hesitancy with regards to working with major powers in Asia. And I would like to ask the reason why that was. That is it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tani, I understand that you're not really feeling well, but still you have raised 3 points, your comments and also raising questions as well. For your questions later, After we have heard from Ms. Koshino and Professor Mori, I would like to ask Dr. Green to respond later for putting everything together. So then I will have discussion with myself and Dr. Mori and Dr. Green. So, Dr. Tani, please feel the safe that you should participate as you like. Now, Ms. Koshino, please. Thank you very much for the kind introduction for this book. When I was with the CSIS and when I was with the women's the college. And also my boss and my the superior, Professor Hosoya. It is a great honor that I have been involved with this translation of the book. Now, when I was with the Asia Policy Division of the Foreign Policy Department at the Sophia University, it was on a class on Asian history, but this book has just been published. So it was used as a text, the role-playing, as well as the mock NSC discussion that were held for the grand strategy and history to be learned. We will be able to elucidate what are the challenges and what should be the policy response that we are able to polish the strategic thinking in trying to nurture and educate the officials who will be leading the way in the U.S. government. And this was highly popular, the class, as I do remember very well. And more recently, at the graduate schools in the United States, applied history, the study of histories to be linked to the actual practices. And there are such initiatives rampant in the United States. And I believe Dr. Green's book has triggered such movement. And as was already mentioned, since from the policy point of view, since I do belong to IWS, the think tank. So for the Cold War period, the strategy was quite interesting in trying to understand the current state of play in the international relations. It was highly suggestive. Now, from that perspective, I would like to make comments. I understand that it will also be live streamed and so forth. So let me very briefly, what were the salient points of the book? In the 5 different periods, the interpretation of grand strategy was made from 1945 to the 1960s. That's to say, after the World War II, China has gone to the communism, and with the collective security order has crumbled, and the United States came up with a containment strategy and tried to rebuild its grand strategy, and that is the first period. And secondly, from 1961 to 1968, the Vietnamese War, the period, the grand strategy of the United States. The President Kennedy and President Johnson's administrations, and the assessment, not from the international politics, but because it is a regional strategy, the Asia perspective and Asia strategy was missing, and that was the big failure. For the national interest of the United States was not really defined, and the United States still started to be involved in Vietnamese War, and that was a failure. And from 1969 to 1975 was the third period in the grand strategy under the Nixon administration. The division between USSR and China that have been focused on, be it President Nixon as well as Dr. Kissinger, what were the policies being presented, and that they have redefined the containment strategy in Asia. Then from up until 1980, from 1977, under the Carter administration, they were once again trying to use the China card in the grand strategy. Then in the 1980 to 1989, that's to say, and they're trying to push back the USSR expansionism, that the very strong Navy has been pursued by the Reagan administration in its grand strategy. So those 5 periods are being taken up in my section. My question is, looking at the analytical framework and effectiveness of the book, when you say grand strategy, there is a concept of DIME, the diplomacy, intelligence, military, and the economic the policies, how are they to be utilized? It was a great learning through this book. But in addition to that, as was mentioned in the presentation by Dr. Green, the five are the lines of contradiction. And it was quite epoch-making and quite eye-opening. Those five themes, whether it is Europe or Asia, or whether it's a continent or the ocean, China or Japan, where to draw the line for the forward defense line, and would it be self-determination rights or the universal values, and protectionism or the free trade. Now, in assessing the grand strategy, this is more of a question. Look, the book says that the United States has it a capability to formulate and implement the grand strategy, that there is no consistency and it's quite inefficient, but overall it may have a strong impact overall to the whole world. But there is another question I would like to raise. This is also mentioned by Dr. Tani. What would you say have been for you being able to say that it has been effective? Will it more of a widely spread in the community, or is it that the leaders have been changed, that you are able to very flexibly change the objective of your strategy? Or is it trying to decide on the correct theme or the goal? So for the grand strategy to be more effective and more efficient, what may be the factors which will make it successful? My second point is about the theme, the implication to the modern times, the contemporary times, looking at the history of the Asian strategy of the United States, looking at the policy of Japan and policy of the United States. What is relevant? Because there are common aspects, some structural the aspects where you see the line to be drawn between the two contradicting themes. One thing is that during the Cold War times, it was actively debated where to draw the line for the defense of the United States. That was a very controversial debate, and that it was always evolving and always changing. But looking at the credibility of the security aspect seems to be flagged these days. Before the Korean the wars, George Kennan under the Truman administration, even though the South Korea may collapse, there will be no impact on the Asian strategy of the United States. That statement has been quoted. But the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan are not being included in the defense line. And after the Korean War, forward the lines have been moved once again under the Nixon administration. And finally, it has become the first island chain. So even though it may be strategically important, but it has nothing to do with the existential or the survivally important aspect. For the United States, what is the region which is existentially important for Japan as well as existentially for the United States? There are some important implications for Japan as well. My second point is that as a common point in the period of the competition amongst the great powers, the grand strategy is needed for that. Of course, there are many differences as compared to the history. During the Cold War period, Europe was placed first before Asia, but still Asia, the prevalence and superiority has for the first time been presented. So it is quite of a good reference to our contemporary times. So as for the specific suggestion, how to set the goals and purposes of grand strategy, what was interesting was that under the Nixon administration to the Reagan administration, after the Vietnamese War, the goals have changed and evolved. During the Nixon administration, that you have lost the credibility from your allies, but you wanted to maintain the status quo. and in the competition of the great powers. But under the Reagan administration, you pursued a victory. And because you had the experience of Nixon administration, the Reagan administration was able to set forth its goal for being victorious. But what about the competition of the great powers today? What should be the strategic goal? Up until now, you had the Trump administration and then Biden administration. You have strengthened your relationship with allies and partners. But then with the next administration, do you have really plausible and appropriate strategy vis-a-vis China? Whether you should go for winning or being victorious, or is it to be something else? Now, it is a grand strategy for multipolar the world, because we are surrounded by multipolar situation. In order to manage in a better way, what should be the aspects that we need to focus on, especially the division between China and USSR? How was it being utilized? If you compare the Johnson and Nixon, the two governments, and if you compare with the Biden administration, so forth, this was highly interesting. In the multipolar world today, who are the important actors? Of course, in the Cold War days, it was China. But which country today will be more important? In your presentation at the outset, that the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, such axis seems to be ever more important. But in your book, you mentioned India several times. So today, as a card, a trump card to be played, how important is India is what I would like to know from you, Dr. Green. And lastly, vice versa, the grand strategy in the past during the Cold War days. If you compare those days and today, there are many differences as well. For example, technology is even more important and relevant today. In the grand strategy framework, not just DIME, but DIME-T is often being referred to. So in the framework of DIME, enough in looking at the situation today. But in the Cold War days, Asia was not that touched upon. That is because the cutting-edge technology or game-changing technology, it was just nuclear weapons or missiles or the outer space or the ABM and so forth. The USSR and the United States, those powers were able to have the grip on. But you didn't have to share the technology with the other countries and other parties. But today, when we look at the competition amongst the great powers, it is more globalized. And supply chain, you cannot really decouple. So for the allies, from the economic security perspective and from military perspective, the United States, in order to win in the competition with great powers, you need the allies and partners to work with you. So you need to have interoperable technology to be shared with your partners and allies as well. But in the Cold War days, did technology matter that much or not that much? Was it relevant or not? And vice versa, how much is technology being important in the competition? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koshino. You have commented on very valuable points. So I'd like to ask Dr. Green to respond to the extent possible later. Now let me turn to Professor Mori. Hello, everyone. I'm Mori of Keio University. First, I would like to express my deep gratitude for being able to serve on the translation supervision together with Professor Hosoya. Through this process, I was able to read every single line of every single chapter, and I have learned quite a lot during this time. I myself study Asian diplomacy, U.S. diplomacy in Asia, and how it links to Europe, UK, France strategy, and also Nixon administration's Asia strategy was also part of my research. But I could never, ever even if I spend the rest of my life catch up to what Dr. Green has accomplished. But together with Professor Hosoya, I was discussing that this kind of a book with such scale and such depth will not be released in any time soon. So we wanted to be as accurate and precise as possible. So I have a lot of duties, but from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. every single morning, I checked every word, every sentence, one by one. So it was a lot of work, but I have learned so much. And so time passed in a flash, and it was a precious opportunity for me. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to turn more to the recent age. So today's theme is a dialogue between history and modern times, which is something that historians need to do, but it's very difficult. But Dr. Green has indeed carried this out. And so President Trump's American First Asia strategy. This is what I would like to talk about, and I would like to ask a few questions on this. Now, Dr. Green talked about this already, but in terms of trade, protectionism or free trade, that is one angle that is being discussed in this book. And trade liberalization of the U.S. has been promoted to benefit U.S. companies. And whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, of course, the Democrats' constituents are Labor Party as well. But in spite of that, the two parties have constantly promoted free trade, prioritizing the benefits for the companies. But recently, with the more difficult economy, protection of labor rights is important. And so if you talk about liberalization of trade, it could disappoint the trade union or the laborers, which makes it difficult for the U.S. Republicans or the Democrats to promote free trade. And the idealization is being divided and being polarized, and both parties must win the labor union or the workers. And so it is structurally difficult for either of the parties to promote free trade. And Elon Musk is going to have a big impact on President Trump. And of course, Tesla needs to sell more EVs in China. So I believe that to some extent, the companies or private sector's benefits will be considered when it comes to the next Trump administration. And Dr. Green said that President Trump will not go that far when it comes to tariffs, as he was talking about, because he needs to be considerate of the benefits of the companies. And so I'd like to ask if my understanding is correct, that such high tariffs will not be imposed to protect companies. That's my first question on trade. And the second is on geopolitics. So you talked about the competition with China and giving Japan a more important role. And I agree with that. But when it comes to Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula, we're very concerned of the Trump administration's policy going forward. So I would like to ask for Dr. Green's outlook when it comes to Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula. So that's my question regarding geopolitics. And my third question is about rules and values. So rulemaking and values. Japan is promoting free and open Indo-Pacific and rule-based international order. These two concepts have been promoted by Japan, but President Trump seems to be rather skeptic about promoting values in the international arena. And maybe under the first Trump administration, it was rather receptive to Japan's input, and that's why FOIP became important. But I'm not sure whether in the second administration, Japan's view on the free and open Indo-Pacific will resonate, because it seems to be more about power rather than values when it comes to competing with China, and also it's more of a transactional policy, and so rules, principles, and values. I believe that Trump administration may be quite skeptic about these points. So that's my third question. And I have 2 more points, very short. So Biden administration talked about connecting Europe and Asia, and NATO's IP4 will continue, I believe. But I believe that President Trump's administration will have people who prioritize theaters. So what do you think the new administration will consider when it comes to connecting Europe and Asia? Would it be separating Europe and having more European countries bear military cost? And for Asia, it's more about China. And so do you think that the U.S. stance on coordinating with Europe and Asia will change? And my last question is, it's going to be a triple red. So both the upper house and the lower house will be majority Republicans. So between the Congress and the White House, even if the Republicans have the majority, do you think that there could be some tension between the Congress and the White House? So when it comes to human rights, for example, the Congress was promoting the Hong Kong Human Rights Act, and President Trump did not want to sign, but he was forced to sign. So the relationship with between the White House and the Congress, even if it's a triple red, maybe the Congress will not follow everything the White House says, and there may be some tension. So that was a lot of questions, and so I'd like to ask a response to the extent possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mori. So all in all, 13 or 14 questions have been raised, but Dr. Green, you can pick up. You can respond as far as you will be able to do so, please.
Thank you. First, let me say again how grateful I am that you all spent so much time in the early morning translating this book, and also how lucky Japan is, and I mean this, how lucky Japan is to have such a robust and dynamic, strategic, intellectual community. If I did this in London or Paris or a lot of other, leading countries in the world, I doubt I would have heard such sophisticated and comprehensive and broad insights. When I was a student at Tokyo University in the 1980s, this was not true. There were a very few people in Japan, but now there's such a rich cohort of strategic thinkers, and thanks to you and thanks to Hosoya Sensei, there's a new generation, if I can call Koshino-san new generation, or Tani-san. So it's very, very encouraging, because I do really sincerely believe Japan's intellectual contribution to the alliance is now much more significant than it has ever been. And honestly, we need it in the U.S. right now. So let me try to pick up some of these. The question from Tani Sensei about Theodore Roosevelt and the relationship with Britain is really interesting. And my friend Kori Shaki wrote a book called Safe Passage, which describes in the 19th century the reluctant American embrace of Britain and the reluctant British embrace of America. It took a long time for us to get over the American Revolution. And even as late as 1897, people like Theodore Roosevelt talked about fighting a war with England over Venezuela. But the fact is, America became more global, maybe more imperial, and Britain became more democratic. And there was a convergence. And I think the convergence in American and British transatlantic thinking contributed to a convergence in thinking about Japan. So the Anglo-Japanese alliance, as Hosoya Sensei knows better than I, grew out of a British sense that Japan was a maritime power with a monarchy, that could be trusted at a time when Britain's global reach was limited. And that led to the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And in a similar way, Theodore Roosevelt, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and others at the end of the 19th century really believed Japan could help carry the burden of maintaining order. They were either wrong or too early. But that's, in fact, in the post-war period, exactly what has happened. So the connection between US, UK, and Japan is very, very significant. So it's a great question from Tani Sensei. Koshino-san, all of you mentioned that this is a kind of, you enjoyed the applied history. And when I decided to write this book, I love history. When I was in fourth grade, we had to give a short presentation to all the parents. And I was supposed to do a 2-minute presentation about the War of 1812. And I don't remember this, but my parents said I did a 20-minute presentation describing all the geopolitical context, the nature of the US Navy, the size of the British Army, and they had to, the Kocho sensei, the principal, was listening and apparently had to make me stop. So writing a book like this was always in my DNA, and I am a historian first and foremost. Because I became more interested in contemporary Asia and policy, I thought political science would be better. But when I worked in the White House, political science was useful, but those of us who were political scientists who worked in the Bush NSC, Victor Cha, if you know him, Condoleezza Rice, Peter Feaver, we all left the government and we wrote history. Because the thing that we needed the most was a sense of what historians call thinking in time. Political science, however, was really useful for this book because there's more structured analysis. I think historians, not you, but sometimes historians can get too involved in trivia. And also, historians sometimes have a bad habit of viewing bureaucrats or politicians as dumb and failed human beings, and strategy as tragedy. And so having worked in government and studied and gotten a PhD based on political science, I thought it was very important to look at this set of problems the way an official would look at it, which most historians don't do. And I had been that official in the White House and the Pentagon. I thought people would be very critical of me, but actually historians gave the book a very good reception. And some of the leading historians in the US pointed out that actually one problem with the history field is in the US, the new generation is writing smaller and smaller topics based on archives they find. Or for political science, they're writing smaller and smaller topics based on some data set from the World Bank. And so I actually got a lot of encouragement from, quite senior historians to write this book because they were actually worried a bit about the field. Japan has avoided some of this, actually. I don't know why. Unlike the UK, Australia, US, Japan has avoided that kind of trend of historians and political scientists retreating into narrower and narrower topics. So please don't give that up. Yuka asked, what makes for good strategy? So I applied the kind of strategic framework on the decision-making of Theodore Roosevelt or Thomas Jefferson that I would apply in the NSC in the Bush administration. In some ways that's ahistorical, but it forced you to look at things historians don't always look at, like trade-offs, options. You asked what's the best way. I mean, ends, ways, and means, and the dime. What are your ends? What are your resources? What is the way you will use them? And then what are the instruments of power in the so-called dime framework? The historical figures who did not have that framework were less effective. You could see it. But even people who had a very clear sense of ends, ways, and means, like Henry Kissinger, made big mistakes. For example, they would forget about the American public. It's a democracy. Kissinger was too European. He got ahead of the public. And there was a backlash after Vietnam. And Kissinger also, I interviewed him quite a bit for the book on background. I never quoted him. He was a brilliant strategist, but he also often forgot about allies. So Churchill didn't say this, people say it was Churchill, but somebody said you can always count on the Americans to make all the wrong decision before they make the right decision. And one thing I think historians miss is when they write histories of the US-Japan alliance in the 1960s, or about US-Australia or ANZUS in the 1980s, and they write about all these terrible frictions during the Vietnam War and so forth, they never ask themselves the question, so why are US alliances so strong today? I mean, they should have died many times. I think part of the answer is that the American system does make lots of mistakes, but it recovers. After Nixon's Guam doctrine in Vietnam and the Nixon shocks with Japan, Reagan recovered. After the Afghanistan withdrawal, which was a disaster, Biden did much better on Ukraine. So the system does recover and correct, and allies are a big part of that. But the other thing I thought I'd touch on is the boisen, the line. The book I wrote after this one was called Riekisen, Line of Advantage, about Abe Shinzo's grand strategy. And by more than Providence, I talked to the 5 or 6 leading American historians to say, is it okay for me to write this? For Line of Advantage, I asked Hosoya Sensei, "Ii desu ka? Can I write this book about Abe's grand strategy?" And it was interesting how much this boisen was such a core problem and challenge for Japanese strategy throughout history, and how well Abe defined it. The problem for a country like the US is, particularly given the distances across the Pacific, if you draw a red line and you fail to defend it, the credibility of deterrence and of alliances can collapse. But if you pull back, as Dean Acheson did after 1949 and the communist victory in China, and he drew the famous Acheson line and said, well, our defensive line does not include Korea. And it was almost an invitation, of course, an invitation for Stalin, Mao, and Kim Il-sung to attack. So the consequences of getting this wrong are very, very important. I know that some of the Trump supporters or advisors who want to pull back from Ukraine are thinking about how to conserve our resources, but they're thinking about the boisen wrong. And it's going to have to be a discussion. I really like what you said about dime T. And in some ways, technology, and especially AI, is the new boisen. And it's difficult in the same way. If the US, Japan, Korea, the Netherlands limit technology transfers too much, you can damage your own innovation. But if you're too permissive, if the line is not well drawn, China will steal the technology. So it's a framework that actually works. So technology is global, unlike the first island chain. So in that sense, it's not regional, but the defensive line questions are the same. And yet, there is definitely a regional dimension to technology strategy. Look at AUKUS. Who are the key players in semiconductors? It's the Netherlands, but it's especially Japan and Korea. And so I think a regional dimension of technology strategy will be very important. Also because it will be easier to work with Japan and Korea than with the EU, because the EU and the US are much bigger competitors. So I didn't write a lot about technology, but when I do the next edition, I'm going to have to say more. And you gave me some good ideas. You asked about the Europe card, the India card. Some people around Trump think they can use a Russia card against China. That will not happen. To me, the two big cards are India and Europe. When Reagan was president, I found this and got declassified in the Reagan Library, a national security memo, in which Reagan and the National Security Council in 1983, I think, said that the rise of India is in American interests, even if we're not aligned, even if we're not allies. And in the Bush administration, that is very much how we thought about India. The most important thing is that India has the capability to stabilize the balance of power, to be a net exporter of security in the Indian Ocean. In many ways, the way that the US and Britain thought about Japan. But I think India is not Japan. in 1902 because of China. And because of the very, very strong diaspora of Indians in the United States, Britain, and Australia. Very, very strong. Very, very important connection. So I'm quite bullish on India. But India is still very much non-aligned in its thinking. A senior Chinese official told us when I was in the Bush administration that U.S.-India, Japan-India strategic alignment would continue. And China could not stop it. And then he said, but it is India, so you will be very frustrated because India is frustrating, slow, stubborn, strategic independence. If we just decide the most important thing is that India has the capability to be a net exporter of security, that's what we need. And the Biden and before that Trump administration, I think, had that concept, so transferring technology. People don't think of Europe as a card. Kurt Campbell does, Jake Sullivan. But Europe is the card we play in China's strategy. It's not Russia. China's international economic dependence on Europe is huge. Until fairly recently, I'm confident the Chinese assumption about Taiwan was that Europe would stay neutral. We need to convince China that Europe will not be neutral. That doesn't mean military forces, it means economic and technological and diplomatic consequences. Unlike the first Trump administration, we now have the IP4, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, are associated with NATO. And the Europeans have shifted profoundly in their suspicion of China. The Trump administration's thinking about Europe will damage that, but won't stop it. So Japan here is in a pivotal position to, Nitobe Nezo said, Taiheo wataru hashi ni naritai. I want to be a bridge across the Pacific. We need Japan to be a bridge across the Atlantic, or the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. Taiwan and Korea. So Korea and Taiwan, both in that voice and that forward line, are challenging. And Korea, because it is kind of continental, fell outside the U.S. thinking. I think now within Congress, support for the U.S.-Korea alliance is much stronger, and support for Taiwan is much stronger. But I'm not sure that's true for Donald Trump. So he might want to have a summit with Kim Jong-un. He might put U.S. forces Korea on the table. I don't think he will get a deal. Remember, Donald Trump wants a good deal. He thinks he can get a good deal. He has a lot of confidence. When he can't get a good deal, he walks away. He walked away from Kim Jong-un. He walked away from Xi Jinping last time. I think it would be very important for Japan and Korea to explain what a good deal looks like and not fall for a bad deal. On Taiwan, former Trump administration secretaries of defense have said in their books, Donald Trump doesn't believe in defending Taiwan. That's a bit of a dangerous piece of information, but I'm not sure the Chinese actually believe that they can get Donald Trump to give up Taiwan. I think that the Chinese leadership has concluded that the American system, the Chinese study their history, and I think they've concluded that even if Donald Trump wants to make a deal, the American system will not change. So there will be some uncertainty, but I don't think a kind of Japan passing grand bargain on Korea or Taiwan would happen. But who knows? Donald Trump might try. Maybe a few more. The rules-based order. Yeah, I don't think, if I were, I know we have a lot of Gaimusho people interested in this topic, I would not go to Washington talking about the importance of the rules-based order or the neoliberal order. It's not their flavor. If you read the America First Policy Institute, which I encourage you to do, it's kind of the blueprint for Trump administration. It is very negative about multilateralism, very negative about the rules-based order, which they think betrayed working Americans. Very positive on competing with China. Very positive on Japan and alliances. This is not the time to be a liberal institutionalist in your clothing. Inside your head, it's okay, but you need to dress like a hard power realist to get progress with this administration. And something like the WTO. I mean, this administration, and in many ways the Biden administration, didn't like the World Trade Organization. But for Japan, for Australia, WTO is a pretty important tool to counter Chinese economic coercion. Well, have a discussion and a strategy on economic coercion and how we cooperate to deter and prevent and respond to Chinese embargoes or intellectual property rights theft. And one of the tools in the DIME toolkit, one of the tools can be WTO. But Australia, Japan would make a mistake coming in trying to be like a priest, asking for a prayer to the international liberal order. That's not the flavor in Washington. I guess the last thing is trade. Donald Trump won mainly because of inflation. Americans were very unhappy with the state of the economy. It's the same reason probably that Ishiba-san did badly in the election here, why Trudeau is in trouble in Canada, why Albanese is underwater in Australia. Inflation. It's James Carville, Clinton's political advisor, said in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. Well, what would high tariffs do? Make inflation worse. So I think that's an important obstacle. The other obstacle, of course, is that other countries will retaliate. When President Trump pulled out of TPP and threatened to pull out of NAFTA, farmers, ranchers, some of his core supporters were panicked because tariffs would go up on beef, soybeans. And so what did the Trump administration do? It negotiated a free trade agreement with Japan, and it renegotiated NAFTA. Biden never negotiated any trade agreements. Trump actually negotiated at least two. So I think there will be some obstacles. It doesn't mean Trump won't do massive tariffs. He'll probably continue to threaten them. That's his style. But it's not something I would predict. I actually think there will be more tariffs on China, for sure. But I think that we'll have to see who becomes the Secretary of the Treasury. I think that Marco Rubio at the State Department and Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, are putting a very high emphasis on closer coordination with allies. Putting tariffs on allies doesn't help. So it's not so easy to implement that promise. I won't promise you that Donald Trump won't do all the tariffs he says, but I think it's much harder politically and strategically than he thinks. And he's an entertainer. It sounds great, but doing it is a little bit harder than that.
はい、たくさんの
Thank you very much. You have superbly given answers to all the difficult questions. The line of advantage, the book that was mentioned, the grand strategy of the Shinzo Abe in the 21st century vision. This is also published from Keizai Shimbun, so I hope you will be able to read the book, which describes the grand strategy of the Abe administration.